You wake up on a Saturday and something in your body just relaxes. No alarm, no inbox, no meetings. You assume this feeling is natural, that humans have always had this, 2 days to recover before 5 days of dread begin again. You'd be wrong. The weekend is not natural. It's not biological. It's not even particularly old. It's a legal invention, fought for, negotiated, and won less than 150 years ago. So, what did humans do before it existed? Not the 2 days off part. The entire concept of a week itself. Start with the number 7 because that's where this gets strange. There is no astronomical reason for a 7-day week. Months are tied to the moon. Years are tied to the sun. But weeks? Weeks tie to nothing in the sky. Nothing in your biology demands exactly 7 days of anything. So, where did it come from? The answer traces back to ancient Babylon, where astronomers and priests tracked 7 visible objects moving through the night sky. The sun, the moon, and 5 planets visible to the naked eye. 7 moving lights, each one eventually associated with a god. The Babylonians divided time into 7-day cycles, partly to honor this celestial pattern, and partly because 7 was considered a number with religious and cosmic significance. This wasn't science in the way you'd recognize it. It was theology wearing the clothing of a calendar. That 7-day structure spread outward from Mesopotamia through trade, conquest, and religious influence, eventually reaching the Hebrews, who gave it something the Babylonians never had: a reason to stop. The Hebrew concept of the Sabbath, rooted in the creation narrative where even a deity rests on the 7th day, introduced something radically new into human civilization. Mandatory rest. Not rest because you were too exhausted to continue. Not rest because the hunting was bad that day. Rest by law, by command, applied to everyone in the community, regardless of how much work remained undone. This was revolutionary and also deeply controversial at the time because it meant a farmer had to let crops sit unharvested. It meant wealth-generating labor simply stopped, on principle, every 7th day, no exceptions. Why does this matter? Because it means the very first version of a mandated day off wasn't about well-being. It wasn't self-care, it was religious obedience. You rested because you were told a higher power rested, and imitating that pattern was part of your covenant. The idea that humans deserved scheduled rest as a basic right hadn't been invented yet. That idea was still nearly 2,000 years away. Christianity later adapted this same structure, shifting the primary day of rest to Sunday in most Western traditions, tied to the resurrection narrative rather than the original Sabbath. By the time you reach medieval Europe, Sunday rest was mandated, often by law, backed by the church and enforced by local authorities. Working on Sunday wasn't just frowned upon. In many regions, it was a punishable offense. But notice something. This gives you 1 day, not 2. For roughly the next 1,000 years, 1 day of mandated rest was simply the norm across most of the Western world, and almost nobody questioned whether that single day was enough, because there was no competing idea of what rest should look like. You had Sunday, the other 6 days belonged to work, and that was simply how life functioned. The second day, the one that actually creates something resembling your modern weekend, doesn't emerge from religion at all. It emerges from something far more contentious. Factories. The Industrial Revolution changed the relationship between humans and time more radically than almost anything before it. Pre-industrial workers, farmers, craftspeople, laborers had grueling schedules, but those schedules were largely self-directed and seasonal. You worked according to daylight, weather, and harvest. Factories eliminated that entirely. Factory labor ran on the clock, not the sun, and factory owners had every incentive to keep workers at machines for as many hours as physically possible. 14-hour days, 6 days a week, was common. Children worked these same hours in many industries. Sunday remained the single sanctioned day of rest, largely because that would have meant challenging religious authority directly, which employers were reluctant to do even when it cost them nothing to squeeze every other day for maximum output. By the mid-1800s, workers had started organizing, and one of their central demands was reduced hours, not eliminated hours, reduced. The idea of an entire second day off was, for decades, considered borderline absurd by factory owners, something that would cripple production and threaten the entire economic order. In the United States, a Jewish community in some early industrial towns had a specific problem. Their religious Sabbath fell on Saturday, but the dominant culture around them mandated Sunday as the day of rest. This meant Jewish workers who observed Saturday as a religious day were often forced to also stop working on Sunday due to legal blue laws, effectively losing 2 income days instead of 1, while everyone else only lost 1. Some factory owners, seeking a practical solution to this specific labor tension, began experimenting with giving all workers both Saturday and Sunday off, not out of generosity, but as an administrative fix. The idea gradually spread beyond its original purpose. Labor unions, already fighting for shorter overall hours, seized on the 2-day structure and pushed it as a broader demand. Not a religious accommodation, but a basic standard for all workers, regardless of faith. The Ford Motor Company famously adopted the 5-day, 40-hour week in 1926, partly under pressure from labor activism, and partly because Henry Ford had run his own internal data and concluded that well-rested workers were actually more productive than exhausted ones. That single corporate decision, driven by cold efficiency calculations rather than compassion, did more to normalize the modern weekend across American industry than decades of labor activism had managed on its own. It took until 1940 for the 40-hour work week and the 2-day weekend to become standard, legally enforced practice across the United States, codified through labor legislation. 2,000 years after the Sabbath was first commanded, humans finally arrived at the specific configuration of rest you now take, completely for granted, every single week. Now here is the part that should genuinely bother you. None of this was designed around how the human body or mind actually functions best. It wasn't built from research on rest, recovery, cognitive performance, or well-being. It was built from a chain of theological tradition, religious compromise, labor negotiation, and one car company's productivity spreadsheet. The 5-day, 2-day structure you organize your entire emotional life around wasn't reverse-engineered from human biology. It was assembled piece by piece out of arguments between priests, factory owners, and union organizers who were mostly trying to solve completely different problems than your well-being. Compare that to what came before agriculture and factories entirely. Long before the 7-day week, long before Sabbaths and blue laws and Henry Ford's spreadsheets, humans didn't organize time into blocks of labor, followed by blocks of recovery. There was no 5 days of dread, followed by 2 days of relief, because there was no version of work severe enough or rigid enough to require that kind of trade. Rest wasn't something you had to earn back after depleting yourself for 5 consecutive days. It was folded into every single day, distributed in smaller pieces, available whenever the immediate demands of survival allowed for it. A hard morning of tracking an animal might be followed by an unhurried afternoon of doing essentially nothing. There was no Monday to dread and no Friday to anticipate, because time itself wasn't cut into a shape that made dread or anticipation necessary, which means the anxious countdown you feel most Sunday evenings, the low dread of the week ahead, isn't some universal, unavoidable feature of being human. It's a very specific, very recent side effect of a scheduling system built by accident out of theology and industrial negotiation. Your nervous system evolved for a completely different rhythm, one without 5 straight days of anything, and without the exhausting, compressed relief of cramming an entire week's worth of recovery into 48 hours before doing it all again. You didn't inherit the weekend from your ancestors. You inherited a body and a mind that never needed one, dropped into a system built less than 2 centuries ago that insists you do. So when Saturday morning arrives and something in you finally exhales, that relief is real. But it's worth remembering what you're actually feeling relief from. Not from being human, from a schedule that was never really designed with humans in mind at all.